Alrighty, we're now recording. Hello and welcome to the our first webinar around road safety and other workplace benefits and mindfulness. My name is Jerome Carslake. I'm the Program Director of the National Road Safety Partnership Program and its many activities. To find out more, please visit the NRSPP website, register for our newsletter, or even better, follow us on social media and you'll be kept up to date with how things are going. Now, today's session is going to be a bit of a different style one. It's going to go for around 70 minutes. Our big focus is going to make us interactive as possible. So once we get through these PowerPoints and a bit of housekeeping rules and some introductions, we're going to free it up and we'll just move through it all. We want to make this as interactive as possible. So questions, thoughts, bubbles, throw them out, and we have three amazing people who will be able to dive into these sort of topics. For those of you who are new, every time I see this slide, I sit there and I look at the picture of myself and realise I've got to update that. But we look at this, there's the Q&A, please use that, throw them in, then we get a good record of the questions as well. There's also a chat box, throw some banter in there and we'll draw on them as well. But once again, I just want to reiterate, we want to make this as interactive as possible because as I said, we've got four amazing presenters and here we are today. So who we have with us today? We have Craig Hassett, OEM. Associate Professor. He's worked in the faculties of medicine at Monash University since 1989 and is coordinator of mindfulness programs across Monash. His teaching, research and clinical interests include mindfulness, mind-body medicine, lifestyle medicine and integrative medicine. So incredible person there. We then have Dr. Richard Chambers. He's a clinical psychologist and internationally recognised expert in mindfulness who provides performance coaching and leadership training to a growing number of businesses and educational institutions around the world. He's also leading a university-wide mindfulness initiative at Monash, along with Craig, and I'll give you a bit of a poke and a tick around that. And he's developed the Smiling Minds app with over 5 million downloads, so massive accomplishment. And then we also have Associate Professor Sjaan Koppel. She holds a PhD in psychophysiology and works at the Monash University Accident Research Centre. Pleasure working with Sjaan as well. Within this role, Sjaan has conducted innovative research that explores the safe mobility of vulnerable road users and leading research in mindfulness and road safety. So once again, we are very lucky to have such awesome people together today. And now, one last little plug before we move on. Craig and Richard created at Monash the #1 and #2 free online mindfulness courses in the world. And the incredible thing is it's been completed by nearly 500,000 people around the world. What an accomplishment in improving lives. Feel free to have a look at it. And this is one of the things that's really the foundation towards what we're going to do in taking us forward. So what we've got here, is our topic for today. We're going to work through this. Mindfulness, what is it not? We're then going to move through and explore.
We've lost your sound, Jerome.
One of the strange things my Zoom does out of everyone else is it throws in a random hissy fit and drops me out. So if it happens, panellists, please just wave at me. That's the first time it's actually happened during a webinar, and Monash IT hasn't been able to work it out. But as I was just saying, Monash University, being here, they're going to be very keen to understand the evidence that's behind it. I'm going to highlight that and walk through it all. And as it's National Road Safety Week, what better way to go through it? How does this apply to road safety? So over to you guys, our fantastic experts.
Well, would you like me to jump in with a question first, Jerome? Like, what is mindfulness and why does it matter? So, and what's it not? So, mindfulness, I guess you could think about in a couple of ways. Firstly, it's you could think of it as a form of meditation. That's how most people think of it. But there's not much point in being mindful for 5 or 10 or 20 minutes, sitting in a chair practicing meditation and then being unmindful for the other 23 hours and 40 or 50 or 55 minutes in the rest of the day. So mindfulness is very much about how we live, not just a form of meditation. And really, so to live in a mindful way, I guess I'd say, is to be present, to be engaged, to be paying attention to what we're doing, who we're with, even in the mundane moments. So to live a really present and engaged life. Now, of course, that means one thing on the road, it means another thing at a meeting at work, it means another thing while you're having your lunch or putting your head on a pillow at the end of the day. But they're the essential elements of being present and paying attention in a kind of a mindful way, just with a sort of a gentleness and a curiosity. Richard, you might like to say a few things about what mindfulness is not.
Well, look, Craig, a common misconception is that mindfulness is meditation.
Just meditation by itself.
Just meditation by itself. A lot of people sort of conflate the two. And meditation, the attention training practice, this sitting in a chair, often with the eyes closed, and training ourselves to stay focused on the present moment, that is obviously the foundation of living mindfully, because we can literally train our brains to be more present, to be more focused. But then it's, as you said, it's the rest of the day. It's when we get up out of the chair, how are we living our lives? And, if we look really closely at it, we're spending half of our lives, distracted thinking about other things. So if we can train ourselves to be present, that's really important. But it's not just sitting around and meditating. A lot of people sort of make that mistake. And really, it's every moment of our lives. As you said, it's how we go to sleep at night, how we wake up in the morning, how we drive to work, how we work. So that's probably one of the biggest, I guess, misconceptions. When people practice mindfulness, particularly when they're practicing meditation as well, a lot of people, this is very common early on, a lot of people are trying to get rid of their thoughts. There's this idea perhaps that mindfulness equals... Oh yeah. Well, exercise in frustration, I think I'd go the extra step there. For anybody that's tried to get rid of their thoughts, whether they're sitting there meditating and just trying to push those thoughts out of their head, or even perhaps lying in bed at night and trying to stop the mind from thinking, anybody that's tried that even for a few minutes will know that has probably the opposite effect in most cases. Yeah. So it's not about getting rid of thoughts. And ironically, it's not even actually about relaxing. There's a lot of research, of course, around mindfulness and stress reduction and relaxation. And of course, when we keep our attention focused on what's actually going on and stop it from getting caught up in all our worries and projections about the future and ruminating on the past and judging and reacting, when we keep our attention in the present, quite often we do start to, I guess, calm down and relax as we stop feeding all of that stress and anxiety. But it's not necessarily about relaxing. And this is a trap that people fall into sometimes. They start to meditate. Yep.
Yeah, a lot of people often get very stressed when they're trying to relax.
Trying really hard to relax and then getting stressed that it's not working. Yeah, that's right. So instead, you've already said before, it's really about cultivating a certain quality of attention or awareness, about being in the present, about accepting and allowing what's happening rather than reacting to it. Doesn't mean resignation, just means accepting and allowing it, and cultivating qualities like gentleness. And once we start to do that, even if we're in peak hour traffic, or we're trying to meet a deadline at work and the pressure's on, we don't have to get caught up in reactions to those things.
If I could just add what mindfulness and road safety is not. So when I talk to people about mindfulness and road safety, people often think that I'm talking about people meditating as they're driving. That is not, that is not what we're talking about today.
And that's because, Richard, when you were just talking about then around that, like at night and those sort of things, if you're more mindful and you begin going through that journey, because there's nothing worse when you wake up at, say, 3 a.m. and you make a mistake of looking at the clock and going, oh, and then you look at the clock and you go, oh, and all of a sudden you're on this cycle and you get frustrated and you're going through that and you're like, I'm now in for a crap day the next day. Can it help with that?
It can help it in a big way. In fact, I'm a clinical psychologist by background, so I do a lot of work with clients with all kinds. I mean, I'm mostly coaching now, but I still do a bit of therapy work with clients with all kinds of issues, stress and anxiety and depression. But, insomnia and, sleep difficulties are really, really common, extremely common, in fact. And one thing I discovered actually long ago in a meditation retreat, Jerome, I used to do these long 10-day retreats. And I remember every time I do them, there'd be one night where I wouldn't sleep at all. I've since read actually things in the literature, like it's not uncommon. I think something's happening. I don't know what it is, but you just can't sleep at all. But if you lie in bed all night long, just kind of meditating, you know, just aware of the breath, aware of the body, perhaps enjoying being in a soft bed under a warm doona in a dark, quiet room with nothing to do, you get up in the morning feeling pretty good. And what I've realized, that's my own experience, and I've now learned, you know, the same thing from lots of my clients. If you're lying in bed and you can't sleep and you're just lying in bed, that's a completely different experience to lying in bed and worrying that you're still not asleep and starting to plan your day or worry about how your day is going to be if you don't get to sleep, because all of those things activate the stress response in the body. And so when we're lying in bed stressing out, that's what makes us feel bad the next day. So if we can avoid that, and that's sort of the acceptance part of mindfulness, we keep the attention in the present with the body rather than letting it wander off and worry or plan the day, but we also practice this sort of an acceptance that this is what's happening right now. And when we do that, it takes a lot of the stress and difficulty out of life.
Yeah, there's a name given to the mode of mind that we go into when we're not mindful. It's called default mode. It's like when we're talking to ourselves in our head. And I mean, at 3 a.m, your mind will give you replays of what happened the day before. You will have done 100 days work mentally in your own head before you even get out of bed in the morning, having conversations with people. This is all called default mode. And we give it a lot of names like worry and rumination and catastrophizing and so on. But it's pretty much the mode of mind we go into when we're not mindful. You know, I often ask this question, you know, to people, you know, about driving. Have you ever been having an argument with somebody while you're driving your car? But the person you're actually arguing with is not in the car with you at the time. And, you know, getting outraged at all the things that this person's saying to us, but it's actually only in our imagination. And so that's the distracted mode of mind we go into when we're not mindful. And it's a very unconscious, low awareness habit that we get into. And in the middle of the night, the mind can be going overtime with that. And, you know, part of the internal default mode, I'm going to be dead in the morning, I can't stand this, why can't I go to sleep? Or, you know, it's like, it's just the mind talking to itself. And it's a complete and utter waste of time, keeps us awake. Well, when we're driving on the road, it's a total distraction from what's happening on the road. And it often gets us angry about things that there's no reason to be angry about. So it's not that helpful being in that kind of state of mind for too much of the time.
That's awesome. And you mentioned the road safety angle there. How does it, like, because obviously when you wake up tired, I like the point, Richard, you just accept it and you lie there, and it's a different sort of experience. And I just sort of wonder, because I know when it's something I don't take home as a learning experience just from this one sort of session, when I wake up, I'm going to try and shift and adapt that. Do the people still wake up tired, just out of interest? Because that then becomes a bit of a risk whilst driving, just out of...
Yeah, definitely. Still tired. You know, you need between 7 and 9 hours of sleep a night. So about 8 hours most people need for their cognitive function to be at its peak, for the prefrontal cortex to be fully online, so that during the day we can think clearly and you know, manage time well and focus on what's important and manage emotions and remember stuff. So if we wake up and we haven't had enough sleep, of course that's going to be slightly impaired. It's more impaired when the stress circuits, the amygdala, for instance, has been running the show all night long, and we wake up in the morning full of adrenaline and cortisol. But it's true, and I notice this in myself. If I don't get enough sleep, my memory is not quite as good. I'm mildly more irritable. I mean, this is one of the beautiful things about mindfulness. You can observe yourself, right? I go through my day and I'm just aware that I'm just the tiniest bit more reactive to things. You know, the mindfulness then helps me not to act on that and hit send on a snarky email or whatever that might want to manifest as. But yeah, so it's definitely, it's true, isn't it, Craig, that if we haven't had enough sleep, we're not at our peak.
That's
cognitively.
right. Yeah, and even if we're mindful and we are tired or fatigued, now I'll speak here, so as a doctor, when we have to do very long shifts as a junior doctor, you could be fatigued through lack of sleep. But if we're mindful, we're aware of the tiredness and the fatigue. And that actually helps us to actually redouble the vigilance, if you like. And it helps to prevent those errors because we take extra care to pay attention, because we recognize the condition of the mind or the body is not necessarily the best at that time. even better to get the sleep. But being mindful doesn't mean, oh, well, I'll never experience any tiredness, but there can be an awareness of the state. Or on the road, and then Sjaan will be able to say a lot about this, about, you know, road rage and other things, is that if we're in a rage and we're not aware that we're in a rage, then bang, automatic pilot reactions, etc. Whereas if there's awareness of our state, it's called self-awareness, there's an ability to make a more discerning choice about how to respond to that.
Absolutely. And it can even relate to stress levels, in terms of if you're driving somewhere to a meeting and you know you're being mindful that you're feeling stressed, you're feeling anxious about it. It's about planning your route. So making sure that you leave enough time, you factor in congestion, parking time. And so then if things do happen, there's a driving situation or another driver that makes an error or a mistake, you can accept that because you've factored that in, you've been mindful about the planning before you even get onto the road. So absolutely. And if you're tired, you are mindful when you're in the car, knowing that you need to be hyper vigilant because you are a little bit fatigued and maybe your reaction times aren't what they would be if you had a perfect night's sleep. So I think it's about being mindful throughout the whole day. So just to reiterate what you both said, not just in the car or not just for the 15 minutes while you're meditating, but trying to do it all day. And as I've heard Craig and Richard say, it's not going to happen all the time, but the practice of mindfulness is catching yourself when you're being unmindful and just really bringing your mind back to the present moment, and not admonishing yourself for getting distracted or being unmindful, but just bringing it back and resetting.
One of the interesting thing that often comes up in mindfulness courses too, Sjaan, is in being late and being pressured and trying to get somewhere. Almost invariably, if you ask somebody, about being late, that there was a moment when they recognized now's the time to leave. And then the mind gets distracted. More often than not, the mind, oh, I'll just do this first.
Yeah.
The person just goes off and does that. Oh, I'll just quickly do this. And it's actually a kind of a form of distraction, because in the moment the person knew they had enough time to leave, but they got distracted, lost focus, and all of a sudden getting in the car, running behind time, rushing, doing things on the road that they otherwise wouldn't do. So being mindful is it's a pretty broad kind of state that really can be very, very informative.
Yeah. And we have collaborated on some research which has shown some findings that shows that people who are more mindful. So I guess maybe Craig and Richard can talk about the difference between trait mindfulness. So some people are, naturally more mindful, and then mindfulness practicing or training. But people with higher levels of mindfulness, we've shown in our road safety research that they have lower levels of aggression on the road. They have lower levels of internal and external distraction. So they're less likely to have those wandering thoughts while they're driving. They're less likely to engage in potentially distracting activities like engaging with their mobile phone. And the other really important finding that we found was that those drivers who did engage in mindfulness training had lower crash levels. So people who were practicing mindfulness were less likely to crash. So that's why we're really excited about exploring mindfulness as a tool for improving driving behaviour and reducing crash-related deaths and injuries.
Well, I've got a great question here from Claire. Claire's asking, I'm particularly interested today because I felt like I was having a panic attack while driving past trucks on the highway yesterday, travelling at 110 kilometres an hour, too fast, too close, too intense. So can mindfulness help with being hyper-aware rather than just being unaware?
Well, depends on what we mean by hyper-aware. I like to sort of sometimes put in these terms, to be alert but not alarmed. So, when we need to be alert, and especially on a highway, big trucks, B-doubles going past, going fast, cyclists on your left, trying to stay inside. You know, so all of these things really do require alertness, and we can be very complacent and unmindful, relaxed in the sense of apathetic and not engaged, and that can cause problems. I wouldn't use the word hyper-aware, but alert. But when we actually get anxious and the mind fast forwards into, but what if this happens, what if that happens, we actually start to play terrible scenarios in our head. That's a form of distraction as well. It actually takes our attention away from the road, making sure we're in the lane where we need to be, being alert to any unexpected things. So we need to be alert but not alarmed, because when that stress area of our brain goes off, like significantly, then it can actually impair the ability for us to process information. It's a kind of form of distraction in itself. We overreact or underreact, and that's not at all helpful. So rather than saying hyper-aware, I'd sort of say it's very good to be aware, and not to take something that we often take for granted, like driving, not to take it for granted. You know, in terms of mindfulness helping us to prioritize our attention, we're on the road. Priority number one is the road. It's not even the conversation we're having with somebody else. It's not the phone. It's not eating our lunch or anything else. The priority is the road when we're on the road. And we only have to have a significant accident to realize how unfortunate it is to take something so important for granted. It's so easy to do in this very distracted world we live in these days.
Yeah. When I was going to add to that, Craig, when we're feeling anxious, if we pay close enough attention so that we can start to see what's happening in our mind, we're not just focused on what's happening.
Yeah.
If we're driving past some trucks and we're feeling anxious, we might be focused, you know, on the road and on the presence of the truck, but on some level, there's going to be some kind of story or reaction to that, thinking, oh, I hope they don't come into my lane, or wow, this is really intense, or there'll be something there that's driving that anxiety. Because when we do keep our attention fully in the present, we don't actually tend to get stressed or emotionally reactive at all. I mean, I think about sitting in peak hour traffic is another example. If we're sitting in traffic and feeling agitated, we're not actually just paying attention to the driving. There'll be some part of the mind that is already perhaps at the destination, thinking about what we're going to do when we're there. And we're annoyed at all these red lights and brake lights and obstacles between us and there. Or we might be caught in some story about, you know, why is there so much traffic? What are the urban planners thinking? Or why do so many people live? You know, there'll be something else that's running. And if we can just drive, you know, really just focus on the wheel in our hands and the body sitting in the seat and just focusing on the road, then we're in the moment. And that's really what mindfulness is. We're just in the moment. We're not caught up in all that other stuff. And so we don't get as agitated or anxious or frustrated.
Mm.
And that moment, because in our thought leadership piece, we sort of mentioned how people drive from A to B and suddenly go, wow, I'm here. I can't remember doing that. But, geez,
I was on the driver. I was the only one in the car. It must have been me, but.
So what's that? Is that just the brain just totally just drifting off, going into sort of la la land away? Are you at more risk as well?
Yes. So that's what we sometimes call the automatic pilot. It's almost like you're driving a driverless car at the time. So on automatic pilot, and we're doing things where there's a kind of a muscle memory that we're very familiar with, but the mind's off somewhere else. Like Richard was saying, we're already having the meeting in our heads before we've gotten there. We're reliving a conversation we're having with somebody before we left. We're thinking about what am I going to have for lunch? And the mind's off in what's called default mode, as we were saying before, but it means the attention's not on the road. And there's this lag time when we're away with the birds, as it were. If something unexpected does happen, there's a kind of a lag time for the attention to get back to where it needs to be. There's something called the attentional blink. Your attention switches back, but it's like the brain's offline, but between 0.2 to 0.5 of a second as well. So, and those little chunks of time, the attentional blink, the kind of lag time in coming back, that can add up to a second or two delay in putting on the brakes, which can make a massive difference. So yeah, it's not a particular, if everything's going as we expect, nothing unexpected happens, and you drive along, and was that light red or green? I don't remember. I suppose it must have been green. You know, it's like, we mostly get where we want to go, and that's good luck, really. But it's not the best.
So, is it a furphy then that I can't multitask?
That's a furphy. That's a furphy. Maybe we should, for all the attendees, define multitasking. There's simple and complex.
Yep.
If you're walking through a park, the walking is simple. If you're having a conversation with a friend at the same time, the talking is complex. One thing simple, one thing complex. Simple multitasking, not a problem. Complex multitasking, two or more complex things at the same time. So, for example, talking on your phone while you're driving your car. And I think Newark's done a little bit of research on this, but I think the figures are about 4-fold increased risk in motor vehicle accidents, which is about, I think, the equivalent of being 0.08 blood alcohol level. So not just 0.05, but 0.08. So it significantly affected. The human brain, male and female, does not pay attention to two complex things at the same time. It's having to flick back and forward. That is not good for memory, attention, reaction time, anything else.
And the reason that talking on a mobile phone is so much more complex than, say, having a passenger next to you is that when you've got a passenger in your car, that passenger can see what's happening in the road and can moderate their own behaviour or conversation depending on the difficulty of the task that the driver's trying to do. But when you're talking to someone on a mobile phone, that person is blind to what you're going through. They have no situational awareness, and so they don't moderate their conversation. And so that's why talking, whether it's hands-free or handheld, is so much riskier than, say, having a passenger talking to you in a car.
Yeah, because the passenger, if you're talking to them and you're not paying attention to the road, and the passenger sees you're about to slam into the back of a stationary truck, they probably start screaming and opening their door and trying to jump out or something. It draws the driver's attention back to the road. But that doesn't happen when you're talking on the phone. And so, and this distracted kind of driving is one of the really major causes of escalating number of accidents now, as you would well know, because there's this modern mythology assumption that we both can and should. It's time efficient, for example. When we're doing that, whether we're just churning our mind all the way while we're driving somewhere or trying to complex multitask, we literally cook our brain. Like we increase the mental load significantly. So we don't wind up with a calm, attentive state of mind to take into the next activity. We actually wind up with a distracted, inattentive, and oftentimes mentally overloaded state of mind. So it's pretty good when driving not to be multitasking. And sometimes even that multitasking can be trying to adjust your sound system while you're driving at 60 Ks on a suburban road with cars coming out here and there and everywhere.
It's an interesting point, Craig, that anything that we do in addition to driving is going to increase our crashing risk, crash risk. I mean, as we said, one person sitting next to us, that's probably about as undistracting as it gets for the reasons that we've talked about. But the moment we're on the phone, the moment we're doing something on the stereo, the moment we're setting the GPS, all of these things take our attention away from the road. And because we can't focus on both things at the same time, we start doing that switching. And that's when we start, of course, getting into problems. The worst thing, of course, is texting and driving, which studies have shown makes us somewhere between 35 and 164 times more likely to have an accident. And the cohort that was 164 times scarily were truck drivers. So, I mean, hence the laws around that. But it's an important thing to keep in mind. And it doesn't mean that we should never, that we can never take a call, we can't listen to the radio, that we can't sort of do anything while we drive, but we just want to be aware of the impact that can have. Obviously, things like texting and touching the phone while we're driving are just crazy, and everybody should be resisting that. But, you go, Sjaan.
And illegal.
Well, that's right. That's right, and that's why it's illegal. I mean, this is also why P-platers can only have one passenger in the car, because if you're still learning how to drive and you've got 4 of your mates all making noise and yelling and screaming at the same time, that's just a recipe for disaster. But a lot of people will intuitively know that, driving around, if we're lost, if we're on icy roads, if the conditions are a bit arduous, people will quite often, just intuitively turn down or turn off the music my car puts the music down when I'm reversing into a parking spot, you know, just because, you know, that's just going to mean that we can focus more on what we need to focus on.
That's great. So what I'm hearing here is like Anonymous put a point in here. What about listening to music while driving? Does it reduce one's mindfulness level? Is there a type of music suitable for driving mindful? And from what I'm hearing here, it's almost like when if you're mindful and you're aware, you sort of know when and when not to do things.
Yeah, more aware. And I haven't seen, and maybe Sjaan can correct me on this, but I haven't seen studies on whether there's background music while driving, whether that has a negative impact. I've seen research on students. So if there's music in the background while studying, students perform poorer than if there's silence. In terms of the effect on performance, if it was very high arousal, fast tempo music, that had a much more significant negative impact on student performance than sort of more soothing or calming music. But I'm not sure. I wouldn't be surprised if there was something similar. And also the other thing is familiar music is more distracting than unfamiliar music. And so, because if the attention's really on the music, if you really are listening to music, oh, I love this piece and so on, it means actually at that moment, the attention's not quite on the road or not in the same way. So, it'd be an interesting thing perhaps to look at as well in the future to see whether just background music has a negative impact like it does with students.
It's like there's another interesting point. Richard, you made this when we were just walking through the practice around even if the phone's on silent and it's just sitting off to the side so you can't reach it and you're not going to be engaging with it, but even if it goes bing or there's a vibration sound, that increases your risk.
That's right. Even just having it there. In fact, there are a few studies. I mean, one of them found that if you have your phone sitting in your pocket and it's on silent mode, you know, just the vibration, you'll make 28% more errors on the task you're doing when that phone rings. The crafty experimenters had the phone number of the participants in this particular study, so they gave them a call halfway through the testing. Now, these people were doing IQ testing in a lab, so measures of memory and concentration and problem solving. And when they let the phone ring out in the pocket, which you'd think, you know, it's not going to cause any problems at all, 28% more errors. So if you bring that into a driving context, even if you're not taking the call, even if the phone's just kind of lighting up or you're getting notifications showing up, that's going to cause a bit of a negative impact. But then an even more fascinating study from the subsequent year found that just having it with us, having your phone with you, decreases performance on tasks. Again, this is cognitive tasks, so it hasn't been done necessarily in a driving environment. But in this study, everybody turned off their phone. So everybody's phone was off. One group then left their phone outside the room in a locker, out of sight, out of mind, and they had the best performance on every aspect of the testing: better memory, better concentration, better problem solving, etc. What was really interesting about the study is the people who had the phone switched off but sitting in their pocket performed significantly worse on all aspects of the testing. So even if it's not ringing, just having it there is distracting enough that it starts to decrease our performance. And as you'd probably expect, the people who had the phone sitting on the desk with them while they did that testing had the worst performance overall. So then when we turn it back on, have all the notifications showing up on the lock screen, have it sitting in the cradle while we're driving, and we keep sort of looking up, you know, we're not checking and not touching it, but we're having a look at who's texting us. That, of course, is going to have a really negative impact.
And another interesting part of that study too, Jerome, was they looked at people who check their phones less than average, average, or more than average.
So were you a phone addict, Craig, I think is.
Yeah, that's right. So those who check their phones more than average, if that phone was in eyeshot, the drop in performance was huge. For those who don't check their phones that much, even if it was eyeshot, you know, on the desk, in the pocket, it didn't really have any consistent effect. And so, you know, if we're the kind of person who's checking our phone all the time, got to get it out of sight because the mind keeps unconsciously and addictively going to the phone, which means it keeps on going off task, whether it's in a meeting or on the road with your partner or anything else. Your kids come up and they're trying to talk, but your phone's there and the mind's just thinking, oh, I wonder if somebody sent me that email from work or something else. The mind, the little addiction center, I'm not talking figuratively, literally is firing off, drawing the attention back to the phone. And so these are unconscious distractors that are becoming major problems on the road and in life and work generally.
Well, Sjaan, you have a name for it, don't you? Or I'm preempting you.
I was just about to add that. So I have a PhD student who's looking at the relationship between nomophobia. So for those people who don't know what that is, it was the word of the year in 2018, and it literally means no mobile phonia. So it's a fear of being without your mobile phone.
Phone phobia.
Yeah, nomophobia. And so he has shown a relationship between this level of severity of nomophobia, the number of hours that you spend on your phone. So, you know, now on like Apple phones or even on Androids, you can have a look at the screen and you can see what your average hours are. So he asked people to go in and find that. So people with higher nomophobia scores had much higher numbers of screen time on their phone, and we're much more likely to engage in potentially distracting activities while driving. So there's a clear link between our fear of being without a phone and distraction. And he also found that it was more prevalent in younger drivers. And his hypothesis is that for young people who have been brought up in this digital age, their digital presence is just as important to them as their physical presence. And so for them not to be able to reach out and instantly reconnect digitally, it's quite traumatic for them. And they're actually thinking of adding nomophobia to the DSM because they think it's a true phobia.
Now, of course, this is true for younger generations. It's true for anybody. I mean, we're all becoming addicted. Well, not everybody. There's one person on this webinar today who doesn't even have a phone to get addicted to. But I mean, you know, the way technology is designed, it's designed to hijack our attention. It is literally designed, because that's the business model of the companies, whether it's Apple or YouTube or Facebook, to get us, keep us scrolling and watching, so that they've got a vested interest in hijacking our attention. There's a great documentary out at the moment called The Social Dilemma, which is on that exact thing. But you know, this habit that we have of checking our phone at inappropriate times begins the moment we wake up in the morning. If we wake up and we grab our phone and the first thing we do is check emails or check Facebook, what we're practicing and habituating is the habit of compulsively checking our phone, as well as, of course, being physically in one place and mentally somewhere else. And we're ingraining that habit. Then we're in the shower and we're listening to something, or we're thinking about the day, and then we're on the road. And what hope do we have of not, you know, grabbing the phone or checking the phone, or even just being distracted by thoughts of what we're going to do when we get to the office? And so we really need to retrain that habit, beginning, first thing in the morning. That's when we need to start really practicing this. Or if we think about the human lifespan, we really need to be training this in our kids. You know, for the parents on the webinar today, you know, modeling good phone and technology use, showing kids. It's one thing to sort of say, you know, don't use your phone too much, but it's another thing to, you know, resist the temptation to be using technology when we're in front of kids or things like that. Now, Sjaan, you mentioned before you mentioned before the relationship between trait mindfulness and better driving. So again, mindfulness, remember, is paying attention and having the self-awareness to know what's happening in the mind and where our attention is. It's cultivating those qualities that Craig mentioned, like curiosity and acceptance and non-judgment. And some people are just naturally more mindful than others. It's just how it is. But the really good news is that it's a trainable skill. So we can cultivate what's called state mindfulness. So anytime we sit and actually just taste our meal, or for the people watching the webinar today, if they're watching it live, you know, just paying attention to what we're saying, or sitting in the morning doing some meditation, just noticing the feeling of the breath or the feeling of the body. Any moment that we're doing that, we're cultivating state mindfulness. And when we do that consistently over time, it becomes a trait. You know, every moment that we practice or cultivate mindfulness, we're rewiring the brain, strengthening the prefrontal cortex, executive function circuits in the brain. And they're getting stronger like muscles, which means that when we open our eyes and get up out of the chair or off the cushion and go about our daily life, maybe sit in the seat of the car or sit down at our desk chair, we've practiced and strengthened the ability to pay attention, to be self-aware, to be emotionally non-reactive. And that's the really promising thing that mindfulness offers us. If we practice it in any context, even sitting quietly on a cushion at home with our eyes closed, it makes us a better driver. It means that when we get to work, we're more able to focus on the work that we need to do. When somebody says, cuts us off in traffic or says something sharp to us, we're more able to manage the emotional reaction that we have to that. So it's a really important thing, this ability to cultivate trait mindfulness.
I was just going to say, so all of the research that we've done to date has looked at mostly trait mindfulness, so getting people to complete a survey about their level of mindfulness or the things that they do each day, getting them to fill out surveys about particular driving behaviours that they might do. And we have looked a little bit at training, but the only mindfulness training and road safety research that we can find used generic mindfulness training, or in the case that we found, it was a Buddhist psychology course. It had really low numbers. And so what Craig, Richard and I and some colleagues from Newark are proposing is that we think that we could see stronger or bigger benefits from mindfulness if it was a driving specific mindfulness training course, so that people can understand how to use mindfulness inside and outside the vehicle. And
outside means enhancement work. So this is like real tip of the iceberg, greenfields beginning area.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How exciting. And that's why I think I've got some great questions to throw at you guys now. And I think just drawing on when you're talking around the focus and the task, like a question here from Andrew. Does mindfulness help in combating hypervigilance on monotonous roads? So we sort of touched on that a little bit earlier. I think that's a great one, considering Australian road trips, summer's coming up, people are heading out.
So does it combat hypervigilance?
Yes, yeah.
Well, I think if we're driving on a road, we need vigilance. And maybe just to sort of say my understanding of hypervigilance, just to sort of see that we're on the same page, is when we're hypervigilant for something, there's one thing that's dominating the attention that makes it hard to engage attention with anything else. So hypervigilance for pain, we're fixated on the pain and not able to engage with the rest of the things in our life. Or hypervigilance for anxiety and the physical sensations of that means it's dominating the attention. So what we want is vigilance, but mindfulness helps us to develop, I suppose you'd say, an agile and flexible attention. But the important thing is that we're able to prioritize the attention where it needs to be. So the attention's mobile, but you're driving along and maybe you've gotten into a town but we're paying attention not on automatic pilot where we're still traveling at 80 or 90 Ks through a 60 K zone and getting booked or anything like that, but we actually pay attention to the context. But there might be an interesting thing on a billboard as you're coming up to a red light, but your priority is the billboard's not the main focus for attention. Paying attention to the slowing car in front of me is. And so the ability to prioritize the attention, not have it distracted by other things. So there's a kind of vigilance, but an ability to prioritize the attention to where it needs to be and to be able to sustain attention, even on long trips. I really enjoy long trips myself, and for me it's a bit of a mindfulness thing, but it doesn't mean you never notice the scenery, you're just looking at bitumen the whole time. But it means just taking in the scene, enjoying the journey. But for me, that vigilance helps us, and to be aware when we are tired and we need sleep. That's a part of self-awareness. Pull over, have a rest when we need it. But so vigilance is all important. But I wouldn't have used the term hypervigilance because that's a different thing.
Right. And I would add to that about the mindfully planning that trip too. So it's not just, that's why I think I keep emphasizing it's inside and outside the vehicle. So planning that trip, knowing that you are going to feel fatigue, either having a plan for where you're going to stop or having, if you want to be spontaneous, make sure that you know when you feel the fatigue and pull over then. So having these contingency plans in place so that you can counteract some of these things that we're a little bit worried about: fatigue, distraction, speeding.
And I think we've got a great question here from Hannah. I'm interested in this topic and how it relates to industries such as commercial passenger vehicles, where using a phone such as Uber and booking rides is so crucial. So how does that, in those sort of sectors, I guess, because you're switching between the phone and driving, is that why, because some of their behaviour can be a bit more chaotic because they're purely focused on the destination instead of actually, like you said earlier, you shouldn't be focused on the billboard, you shouldn't be focused on passengers, you should be focused on the driving task.
Mm. Yeah.
Well, you'd hope that in the Uber induction, there's some instructions around not touching the phone while you're actually underway. I mean, I imagine that the app's designed that perhaps, I don't know, I guess you have to touch it to accept a ride or something, or maybe it automatically allocates, I don't know. But once you're underway, there's a map. Yeah. And having a map going and paying attention to the map, other researchers found isn't actually as impairing in terms of driving as, listening to a podcast or something unrelated to the driving. So it's not a problem having a map there. But of course, if someone's touching the phone, if they're too fixated on the map and not actually paying attention to the road, that's going to cause a problem. And these days, with everybody having GPSs on their phone or in their car, I think it's so easy to kind of, and then of course, the cars these days have got, the responsive, the cruise control that locks to the car in front. My car keeps me in the lines. I mean, it's insane, it's like it does everything it can to stop me having an accident, which is amazing technology. And the more technology we have, the easier it is to kind of, metaphorically go to sleep while we're behind the wheel. So we do need to be really, really careful. And I think particularly for Uber drivers, taxi drivers, road transport drivers, making sure that they're not touching the phone, as we've said a number of times, but also just making sure that they are paying attention to the right thing at the right time, as Craig was talking about a moment ago.
Yeah, that's right. So if you're at a red light and you just need to accept a call, for example, because there will be a cost if trying to do two unrelated things at the same time. And as Richard was saying, following a GPS while driving are two parts of the same one task, driving. And the areas of the brain that are engaged in both the looking at the GPS and navigating the road, those areas of the brain are communicating with each other, but two totally unrelated tasks are quite different things. And so we really do need to avoid that because it will come at a cost. And if we're not micromanaging our attention in that way.
And even having a look at the map and getting a general sense of where you need to go before you even start the drive. It's just planning and as long as you're not also, I've been in Ubers where, they're legally using the app to guide them, but then they're accepting phone calls and on two different phones. That's probably not very safe.
As if one phone's not bad enough. Let's have multiple phones in the car now, shall we? I've been doing something recently where before I head off on a journey, before I plug in Google Maps, I try to visualize the journey.
Yes.
That's a dying art, that one, I think, the ability to actually imagine where we need to go. Because the more, as I was saying before, the more we use the technology, the more that part of the brain just goes to mush. I mean, literally, we lose that ability. So
memory circuits and attentional circuits are wasting away in this sort of online world, according to a lot of the research on that. I used to love the old days, especially when I was doing some locum work, and you get out the Melways, and I might be down in a southeastern suburb and I need to get up to a northwestern suburb, and I'd plan it out and on the Melways, and I used to kind of just practice memorizing the route, and every third turn I need to go there and da-da-da. And but you had to use your memory a lot more than these days, being on automatic pilot with the technology telling you what to do. And we never actually get a picture of the road, of the layout of the city in the way that perhaps we might have once done that.
But maybe your brains are wired a bit more spatially than mine, because when I used to have Melways, I would write the instructions. So I would write
turn by turn.
At the petrol station. And if anyone said head west, I would be like, I have no idea what that means.
Landmark Festival. Actually, I think a great question here from Sally around that wired. I'm interested to know if there is any research about this, more specifically regards to people whose brains are already hardwired to wander, like those with ADHD.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of the activity of the default circuits in the mind in ADHD, sort of distraction circuits. And so it is more challenging for some people who, for one reason or another, and it's not just genetic disposition, it can be environment, the amount of screen time we have can increase the risk of having attentional problems. You know, we draw a line in the sand and we say, oh, that's ADHD and that's not. But if we just consider we're all on a continuum, and as one article in the Harvard Business Review described, attention deficit trait, the tendency these days to have shorter attention spans and find it harder to focus. And so this is something that really challenges the whole human race. But if a person, whatever the situation, practices being more aware, practices very gently, non-reactively, just bring the attention back and so on. We exercise the attention circuits in our brain. We wire the brain increasingly for attention. We find it easier to notice when we're distracted, easier to bring the attention back on board. But Richard, you know, said something right back early on, that if we notice the mind wanders, thoughts coming into our head, we get angry and reactive and judgmental about that, we actually accentuate the very problem we're trying to get rid of. So we want to be able to notice the distractibility, but in a kind of a gentle, sort of non-reactive, non-judgmental way. But if we practice it, we'll get better at it. But clearly, you know, for many people who might have more attentional problems, it does require a little bit more patience and effort.
But that neuroplasticity that you're pointing to there, Craig, the idea that we've got to use it or lose it brain is one of the most promising findings in psychology, you know, whether it's mental health or performance in the last few decades, the discovery that the brain's constantly changing, and we might have been practicing or even feel like we're just somehow inherently wired for distraction. But the moment we start cultivating mindfulness, we start to change that habit again. And that's the really promising thing about this. And that's why, of course, a driving specific mindfulness program has so much promise as well, because we can literally perhaps train people to focus on the driving in a systematic way, whether it's sitting in a chair at home or sitting in the seat of the car. I mean, it's the same kind of thing. You know, we're trained to focus on the driving, and that's going to just make for better drivers, and literally, you know, hardwire that into the brain so that it becomes an enduring trait. But also, as we've said, that when they get to the office car park, get out of the car and go and sit in the desk chair and start driving the desk, it's exactly the same rules apply. You know, they've trained, you know, we've trained the attention, we've trained the non-reactivity. So it's a fantastic investment, and one that everybody should make.
And I just would add, in this increasing world of automation, everyone thinks that automated vehicles or even automated machinery in workplaces are going to reduce errors, injuries, deaths. We're going to have this sticky situation in the interim where we're partially automated and partially not, where people will have to regain control of either the vehicle or the machinery when, you know, the vehicle says, oh, I don't know how to do this, you take over. And so I think mindfulness is going to be even more important, that people don't get distracted by watching Netflix, or that they still need to be conscious that they are driving a vehicle. So it will be this balance between driving and monitoring and mindfulness. So I think it's going to be really important in the future.
It'd be great just to tease that out a little bit more, because there's a question here around, can engineering controls in a vehicle help improve mindfulness, e.g. speed alerts, seatbelt alarms, fatigue alert devices? Can these help change behaviour related to mindfulness?
I think so, definitely. And to follow up from what Richard and Craig were saying, if we were to develop a specific mindfulness training course, we could anchor those in with those particular things within that particular vehicle or that particular driving task or that particular workplace situation. So I think anchor points are really good, but I'd love to hear what Craig and Richard say about that as well.
Well, it's going to be interesting as life becomes more automated. I think humans are probably going to go more on automatic pilot, and a kind of a sort of an unconscious habit that will come in very quickly. I don't need to pay attention anymore. So that may well sort of come at a cost. When in industries, for example, where they have a low tolerance for errors, like the airline industry, you know, I'm very happy to, I don't want to put in an advertisement, but fly a very safe airline, as I do. But when they're going through a procedure, they don't, if that procedure gets broken halfway through, they go back to the start and complete it again in one unbroken sort of task, if you like, from step 1 to step 10, for example, because it's when we break a procedure that we're often making mistakes. So you get in the car, and you know, if you don't have all these automatic things on, and something disrupts you while you're having you put your belt on yet, and maybe you've done the lights or whatever, but you know, or we just forget things. That's when we make errors, when the flow of tasks get interrupted. And these days, there's so many things getting into the car, phone goes off, kids do something. That's exactly the time we forget things. So we're kind of, in a way, becoming more distracted, but the technology, I guess, is filling a gap. But it may come at a cost in terms of human attention. It'll be interesting to see which way it goes as to whether it ultimately reduces errors or increases them. I'm not sure.
That's great. Well, one other thought, question from Leanne. What sort of practices would you recommend for someone who has anxiety around driving following an accident?
Richard, do you want to chip in?
Yeah, it's interesting. In my early 20s, I remember before I got my license, actually, it must have been like, I think I was like 19 years old. And in 1 year, I was a passenger in 3 accidents, 2 that rode off a car and 1 that was just a sort of minor thing. And I remember after that, getting in, it motivated me to get my own license, because I thought, man, I'm probably in better hands if I'm behind the wheel here. Like, I don't know what the bloody hell my friends are doing. But I remember, you know, every time I'd go around the bend, you know, just go around a corner, you know, at 30 in second gear, I felt like I was skidding out of control, because the mind can do all sorts of incredible things. Now, of course, the car was going around the corner in second gear, you know, totally safely, but my mind was making it into something else. And that again is and we said that sort of towards the start of the webinar today, that mindfulness helps us to notice when the mind is caught up in something other than what's actually happening. And that, of course, was a trauma reaction, actually, on my part, you know, and it was sort of programmed in from those accidents, and it was unconscious. I didn't know what was happening. I just felt very anxious being in cars. But of course, you know, the training there is to notice when you're feeling anxious and realize, well, hang on a sec, I'm imagining that the car's getting out of control, or I'm telling myself I'm unsafe, or there's something else going on there. And I do this work as a psychologist all the time with my clients as well. You know, very often, you know, people with phobias or anxiety disorders, there'll be some innocuous, you know, situation that's either reminding them of something, or perhaps their mind's just, you know, getting carried away anyway. You know, people walking past building sites and thinking that they're, you know, breathing in industrial chemicals and going to get sick, or their kids are going off to school and they're worried that something's going to happen to the kids. And of course, it's about, you know, I mean, you can challenge those thoughts. Once you become aware of them, you can start to sort of think statistically, or tell yourself, you know, reassure yourself that everything's going to be okay. But I think even mindfulness does a powerful thing when we learn to notice, oh, that's that default mode. It's very compelling default mode. It seems like it's true. But if I just bring my attention back to what's actually happening here, you know, then suddenly we don't feel so stressed out, and we're maybe able to drive, you know, around the block, or, you know, there's an approach in clinical psychology called systematic desensitization, where, you know, you do a little bit of something that's scary. Just maybe get in the car and sit there for a few minutes and then get out, or maybe turn on the ignition, or maybe go out of the driveway and come back in, or go around the block. And ultimately you can train yourself to go on a drive again. But each step of the way, noticing when the mind's getting caught up in the stuff that's causing anxiety, and just bring it back to what's actually happening.
Because that's what happens when we experience something. We relive it a few times in the mind vividly, and the emotional reaction paired to the memory, and then the mind projects that into the future. And so that's, you know, it's bread and butter, not mindfulness. And so as Richard was saying, to ground the attention back in the present moment, even for people who haven't experienced something like a plane crash, but the number of people who have phobias about, the mind will have played 1,000 plane catastrophes in the lead up to getting on the plane. And it feels so vivid and so on. And we're taking imagination to be real. So to be able to ground ourselves back in the present moment, back again and again, and learning to feel comfortable with that little wave of anxiety if it arises, less reactive to it. Mick Fanning, for example, the famous Australian surfer, had that shark attack a few years ago, and he had to practice a lot of this kind of stuff to get himself back in the water. So that he was actually right in touch with the moment when he was going down the face of the big wave, not reliving an event from the past and projecting it into the future. And it really can require a bit of patience and practice. And in a therapeutic situation, you need somebody like, say, Richard or some other well-trained person with good mental health credentials, good mindfulness training to guide a person through that kind of situation.
That's great, man. Last sort of 10 minutes now. Good question here. Everyone's been hearing around mindfulness and the benefits, the impact, how it relates to road safety. What I like it from Scotty, he says, I would suggest that few people would be sufficiently self-aware to recognise the need for mindfulness. What suggestions can you offer to help make the common person be more aware of the need to be mindful?
I think it's a great point, isn't it? That we can be so unmindful that we don't know how unmindful we are. I mean, that's one of the things. The moment somebody starts practicing mindfulness, whether it's through meditation or just unitasking or being mindful throughout the day, one of the first things they notice is just how distracted their mind is. And that goes from, there's that model of unconscious incompetence that becomes conscious incompetence, realizing, wow, I'm distracted a lot of the time here. And that's an important first step. And Craig and I see this all the time in the courses that we run, the face-to-face and online courses that we run, that in the early phases, people become more aware that their mind's wandering, and they see it almost as a failure, like, oh, this is making my mind worse and it's making things more, even busier. But of course it's not. It's, I mean, to use a metaphor, that they'd previously been walking around in a dark room, mostly doing okay, every now and then bumping into something sharp, but blissfully unaware of what was going on. And mindfulness lights a candle or one of those old oil burners, and suddenly there's a little bit of light and you start to see, wow, this place is a mess. But that gives us the opportunity to then start training ourselves, to be more present, and that can start to become conscious competence, where we're driving the car and we're touching the phone and we think, no, I don't want to touch the phone. I want to focus on the road. Oh, I'm already at the desk. No, you know what? I'm just going to focus on the road. And that's the training that we do. And in time, once we've done that, we eventually, that state becomes a trait and we get that unconscious competence where we just start to drive, safer or, work with more presence. One of the interesting things that happens as well in courses is I'll often give people the homework task to do things, do everyday activities with mindfulness, to bring mindfulness off the cushion into everyday experience. And one of the big ones, of course, is walking or driving around, moving around and commuting. And without fail, when people start to drive more mindfully, they become terrified because they start to notice how everybody else is driving around literally asleep at the wheel. I mean, we're all doing this as a society, and no one really notices. But then you start to come out of that unconscious incompetence and think, holy hell, everyone's just looking at the phone and clearly not paying attention to the road. But it's a good sign. It's a really good, just to respond to the questioner, it's a really good sign as we start to become aware of that.
And I think too, if we start to become more aware of the cost of being unmindful, the time we waste through having to reread something again and again, the way that we don't enjoy our lunch because we're not tasting the food, the miscommunication because we're not listening to the person that's speaking to us, the accidents and errors we have, and not just in the car, but, at work, forgetting to attach that email because our mind was getting ahead of ourselves, And so all of the cost of being unmindful is significant. So if a person actually starts to become aware of that and adds it all up, the case for practicing a bit of mindfulness starts to make itself. And it can't impose it on somebody else. A person has to see that for themselves.
And I think organisations and society as a whole need to stop prioritising multitasking. I mean, I used to wear it as a badge of honour that I could be cleaning the kitchen, feeding my kids, listening to my husband's day, answering emails. I thought I was accomplishing it all, but in fact, I was doing all of it badly. I didn't do any job well. And I worked out that if I do one thing at a time, I can finish that, give it the attention that it deserves, and then move on to the next task. And that's what we need to do in workplaces and in the car.
Great. So I'm going to combine a couple of questions here, and I'll throw this at you, Sjaan. So I've got Dwianto from Indonesia. Thank you for streaming in. was just asking, is there anything around awareness for truck drivers at all? Anything that aligns with that? And it sort of aligns earlier going, what sort of relationship, has anyone actually touched on this in the heavy vehicle space?
No, so Richard Craig and I and colleagues from Newark, we conducted a systematic review looking at what is the evidence out there about mindfulness and road safety, and there was absolutely nothing in workplace drivers, heavy vehicle drivers. The only thing we could find was in passenger drivers. So there needs to be a lot more work done in that space. And we've been talking to people in the heavy vehicle and in logistics. People are screaming out for it. One problem though that someone did identify is that they've had to rebrand it so it's not called mindfulness because they didn't think any men would do it, which I think is ridiculous. But yeah, I think that there are major benefits in terms of not just road safety, but even health and well-being for heavy vehicle drivers. Incorporating mindfulness maybe would help their sleep. All those things that we know are problematic for heavy vehicle drivers.
Well, one of the really good things that's come out of this webinar is we've got a volunteer, Scott. So we'll follow up with you, Scott, separate. He says, look, we've got some things around helping drivers be mindful on task. So you never know what pops out of these things. It's fantastic in that sort of sense. One other sort of question is drawing from David, and then we're just about to run out now. And it sort of draws again on that ADHD sort of angle, but are there other personality or social economic factors that make certain individuals better or worse in achieving mindfulness? And do these correlate to factors known to cause common issues with regards to engaging in illegal or dangerous behaviours?
Look, that's definitely true, Jerome. I mean, some people are, as we've already said, are more naturally mindful than others. Things like stress and anxiety and depression, they're in some sense the opposite of mindfulness because the mind, rather than being present, is caught up in depressive rumination or worry or things like that. And of course, people with lots of, financial stress in their lives or lots of, things happening in their life, of course, that's going to be calling for their attention and making it harder to focus. So yes, I would say there are a whole lot of factors that make it harder to be mindful. But again, we can just come back to that basic point that mindfulness is something that everybody has. I mean, we all have at least moments throughout the day where we're present. And it's something that's trainable and quite easily trainable. And any moment that we're training mindfulness, we are literally rewiring the brain and strengthening the attentional and memory circuits in the brain. So it doesn't matter how far behind the eight ball we are, if we consistently practice and apply the things that we've been talking about in the webinar today, that's going to make a difference. And for some of us, it'll be easier than others, but everybody can benefit from this. And probably the people who find it the hardest, like the people with ADHD or the people with a million things on their mind, are actually the people that are going to benefit the most.
Yeah, and I think it's really important if somebody's got some significant challenges in one way or another, is to learn from somebody who's really well trained, who can help that person navigate their way through that. And just an app by itself, or just a guided practice that you download or something off the internet by itself may not be enough. You may want some support, encouragement, and instruction about how to navigate it. But anybody can benefit. And in fact, if we've got issues, then the more issues we have in relation to attention, as Richard said, the greater the potential benefit.
So the more you're struggling to be focused, probably the more important it is to do it. So if you haven't got time, it's even more important you make time.
Yeah.
Yep. There was a study, Jerome, that found that 6 minutes of meditation in a classroom led to better test performance, better memory retention, better recall, less distraction, and better performance on a test. And when they looked at the individual participants in that, they found that the students who were younger or who had more attentional problems, they had even more benefit as a result of doing the program. So I guess if you're coming from a sort of a low baseline, you're going to experience more benefit than somebody who might be, already quite mindful.
Yeah, and think of it as somebody who's quite fit could do some more training and be a bit fitter, but somebody who's quite unfit will get the most benefit from doing some level of exercise. And I think it's the same with mindfulness as well.
That's great. Question here for you, Sjaan. So Michael was just saying, what about defensive driving behaviours and techniques? Would they align with mindfulness qualities, do you think?
It depends. The research is out on that. Some defensive driving has been shown to actually encourage more, like taking more risks.
That's offensive driving, isn't it, Sjaan?
Yeah, so I think so. If it's about being present in the moment, I mean, some of those defensive drivings are about the mechanics of the vehicle and how to get yourself in and out of situations. What we're talking about is paying more attention on the road, being accepting of the driving situation as it is, whether it's congested or not, whether there's roadworks or not, whether someone makes a mistake in front of you, cuts in front of you, planning time so that you can get there and not be worried or stressed about that, and trying to leave all your worries behind and not getting into those conversations with yourself or arguments with yourself on the drive.
Yeah, I think there's certainly some potential there, you know, the awareness on the road too. And I've never been in this situation as well, but people describe it, you know, that, you know, if the car's going off the road and there's a tree, another tree, and there's a gap between them, you know, the micromanagement of attention to actually have the attention on the gap, not on the tree, really requires, I think, a pretty good ability to manage the attention under a pressure situation. Probably about the level of complexity of trying to manage your attention on a golf course when there's a water hazard in front of you. Do not look at the water. The green grass on the other side of the water hazard. It's amazing, like a magnet for the for the attention and for the ball. And I think in the same way, to, you know, in a fast-moving situation like that, to actually have the attention be very challenging. A person have to be very calm to be able to do that.
Well, this has been an absolutely fantastic discussion with the three of you. Thank you so much for your time. I'll bring up contact details for us all in a tick. But before we do that, I'd just like to ask each of you, look, if one take-home sort of message or one sort of comment you'd like to leave, and I guess whoever gets to go first on this, I'll go alphabetical. Craig, if you want to start on this one, what would be your sort of one take-home message you'd like to leave everyone with?
Well, be mindful on the road. I mean, it can be as much an opportunity for mental rest as anything else. So, you know, let it be a space in your day, just attend to the road. And then when you get home, hopefully with a calm, attentive state of mind, take it into the house with your friends and family. Be good.
Awesome. Richard.
Look, we live in a very unmindful world, and anything we practice gets stronger. So there's definitely a strong case for practicing mindfulness these days, and you know, any practice that we do really makes a difference. And if we're not practicing mindfulness, by default, we're going to be practicing unmindfulness. We're going to be getting more distracted and more reactive. So if we don't want that to happen, whether it's at home or on the road or at work, we really need to be practicing mindfulness in some way, whether that's with meditation or just paying attention to what we're doing in each moment.
Fantastic, thank you. And Sjaan, as it's Road Safety Week and today's theme is workplace road safety, it's a fantastic chance to sort of close out.
I think if the coronavirus and the restrictions that we've undergone here in Melbourne have shown us anything, is that we should be grateful for the commute, and that a lot of people actually do like that commute to bookend, you know, the work day, but to be present in there, not to go on autopilot or to default mind. Be grateful for that drive, be present in that drive, and be safe in that drive.
Wow. 3 fantastic closing messages from you guys. Thank you so much. Let me just bring up, so for those, hopefully that's come up and you can see the contact details. Thank you so much for joining us today. You can see the contact details for Sjaan, for Craig and for Richard right in front of us. They will be circulated afterwards. Thank you very much to the audience. So thank you, Sjaan.
Thank you.
Thank you, Craig.
Thank you, Jerome.
Thank you, Richard.
Pleasure, Jerome. Thank you.
And everyone, take care today. Enjoy and have a wonderful day. And be mindful as well. Be in the moment. Thank you.